Imagine, if you will, that you're on vacation with your favorite person in your favorite destination. Maybe you're walking along the Rhine or the Amalfi Coast. You could be visiting Porto or Bordeaux. Perhaps you're taking a riverboat cruise through Burgundy and the Rhone, or you're boating on Lake Como. You're visiting historic landmarks, protected botanical gardens, museums, walking in the footsteps of millions of people throughout the history of the most culturally relevant towns and regions across the globe. You stop in a little cafe and you order a plate of locally grown, handcrafted cuisine, and along with it comes a nameless carafe of the region's best wine. That shared meal and that shared wine will be among the best of your life, creating lasting memories that you'll take home with you and think about forever. Now imagine that those same cafes have nothing local left to serve because the vineyards, the farms, the gardens have all become deserts. Everything on the table is imported from a new breadbasket in wine regions in China or Siberia. Your experiences are no longer authentic and cultural, and regional identity has been lost. No longer are tourists flocking to your heritage zones or landmarks or vineyards or even your towns and cities. This reality is already happening across the globe today. It may just be the beginning, but your cultural identities and heritage are beginning to fade. Tuscany is well known for its picturesque rolling hills studded with tidy rows of cypress and poplar trees winding their way along ancient sun-soaked roads. Natural stone and plaster structures wound with wrought iron and topped with terracotta shingles clustered together, creating villages dating back more than a millennium. Speckled across this countryside are grand estates and Renaissance palaces anchoring the vast vineyards and forests. Some of the most important, prestigious, telling, and traditional wine regions in all of Italy, in all of the world, are located in the Sienese province of Tuscany in central Italy. The lands were settled by the mysterious Etruscans as early as 900 BC and were planted lush with vines then. Some were brought with the Etruscans to the region and others were already native to the land. The Etruscans were keen grape growers known for trellising their vines and irrigating their crops. Florence may be the capital of Tuscany, but Siena seems to be its heart and soul. Siena is located 1 hour south of Florence, 2 hours north of Rome, with Pisa just to the northwest and Cortona to the east. Siena is nestled in the center of the Tuscan region with the Chianti Hills to the northwest, northeast, and south, Montanola Sienese to the west, and the Araba River is to the south. The Merse and Elsa valleys and Crete Siense round out the famed enological and gastronomical region. Legend holds it that Siena was founded by Sienese and Ascius, the sons of Remus and the nephews of Romulus, the orphaned founders of Rome. After the murder of their father by their uncle, the boys fled. One was on a black stallion and the other a white, and they stole the Capitoline wolf to found a new city and a fresh legacy in Siena. Siena bears the name of Sienese, and the city's coat of arms is blazoned with black and white, reminding everyone of the spirited lads and their horses. The name, however, could have many meanings. Records show prominent Etruscan families with the name Siena, a Roman family named Sieni, and along with the Gaulish tribe, the Sienones. We do know that the Latin word senex, which means old, and sieno, which means to be old, are derived from the name of the ancient city of Siena. Early in its story, Siena was very remote. There was no major roads connecting it with any other cities, and there's no waterway through this region. It was isolated from the early Christian and Roman influences until after the fall of the Roman Empire. It became a pilgrimage stop, bringing diverse peoples and cultures to the city. It instilled a strong sense of independence and regional identity that carries through the legacy families of today. The Lombards invaded the region in the 5th century and brought with them new prosperity by rerouting the roads and connecting the city with major economic centers like Rome, Florence, and Venice. Siena became a boom town of industry and agriculture. It was at this time that the system of aristocracy was put into place just after Charlemagne conquered the region in 774 AD. The Franks began to marry into the Sienese citizens. In 1115 AD, Siena became one of the earliest independent republics on the Appian Italic Peninsula. The city grew to a population of more than 50,000 regular citizens, which at that time, outside of Rome, was one of the biggest cities in the peninsula. In the 16th century, despite the wishes of more than 700 Sienese families, the occupying Spanish king, Philip II, who was flat broke and indebted to the powerful and merciless de' Medici family, was forced to succeed Siena to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, where it remained until the unification of the Italian state in 1861 AD. Nevertheless, the 12 Sienese noble families remained in place and in moderate power as landowners, religious figures, and politicians. Modern Siena is still medieval in culture. The city is divided into 17 wards known as contrada. Each designates a clear regional boundary and its own traditions and identities. The 12 original Sienese aristocratic families are the head of 12 of those contrada. The other 3 are headed by families that predate the aristocracy. The contrada where you're born becomes your contrada for life, giving the families of these regions a tribe and a unique cultural identity within the city walls. Siena is steeped in incredible regional character and cuisine, centuries-old traditions, and a millennium of Catholicism, ancient Etruscan and Roman culture and ruins, and then Renaissance and High Renaissance art and architecture. Siena is also drenched in wine, and what wine it is. There are few truly exceptional wine-producing regions in the world, and the Sienese province of Tuscany is one of the best. Siena lies at 43 degrees latitude, which is much farther north than one imagines when you're looking at that golden-hued landscape or a map of the world. It's actually on par with southern Oregon, southern Idaho, Caledonia, Minnesota, Lake Michigan, the Niagara Falls, Concord, New Hampshire, and the Gulf of Lyon between Barcelona and Spain, in addition to Marseille, France, and Corsica. Siena is 322 meters, or 1,056 feet above sea level, and some of the sloped vineyards reach 500 meters, or 1,640 feet in elevation. It's actually considered quite high for the region. The warm Mediterranean climate and close proximity to the cooling Tyrrhenian Sea to the west make Tuscany the perfect place for cultivating grapes. Tuscany has long, warm summer days and cool nights with rain in the late autumn. Winters can be brisk in this region, and they do get dustings of snow, but it's not extended deep freezes that can harm the vines in the vineyard. It is in this perfect setting around Siena that the most iconic wine regions in central Italy are found. It's true that Tuscany produces great wines all over the region, but the truly exceptional and coveted wines come from the Sienese province. Lucky them. The Chianti Classico and Chianti DOCGs lie in swaths to the northwest, northeast, and south, due north and northeast. Brunello di Montalcino DOCG is directly to the south and southeast. Vinoble di Montepulciano is farther southeast, and Vernaccia di San Gimignano DOCG is to the north and northwest. Collisense DOCG is due west of Siena. Slightly farther afield are other incredible regions, including Bulgari and Morellino di Scansano. Not only is the whole of Tuscany governed by the EU and Italian wine laws, such as DOC and DOCG, much of it, including Siena, is protected under UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, as World Heritage Sites for their universal value to humanity, history, and heritage. Tuscany is the land of Sangiovese in all of its unique regional expressions. Sangiovese is a very ancient grape. The name derives from Latin, and it means Sangus Jovis, or the blood of Jupiter. The grape is known for its elevated acidity and notes of fresh strawberries, regional cherries, crushed herbs, dried orange peel, and a spice in its youth. In Chianti Classico, we find ripe Morello cherries, tangy red raspberries with layers of crushed oregano, and a signature spiciness that shines through that bright acidity, before giving way to a moderate structure and slightly gritty tannin. Brunello di Montalcino is famous for its single clone Sangiovese Grosso that imparts notes of rich sandalwood, a dusting of cocoa over the brandy-soaked Amarena Fabri cherries and dark plums. And Brunello also offers a hint of sweet tobacco, espresso, tomato leaf, cured meats, or wood smoke on finish. Vino Nobile di Montepulciano is an elegant and restrained wine amongst the Tuscan Sangioveses, but it shines with lifted acidity, gentle strawberries, and cherry fruit on the backdrop of a silky roasted hazelnut note, mocha, and a sprinkling of cinnamon. Often with balsamic vinegar notes, coffee, leather, charcuterie, or even a nice vanilla note that can be found with the oaked age Reserva or Gran Selezione bottles of Sangiovese. In a region dominated by Rosso, red wines, Vernaccia di San Gimignano shines Bianca white. First produced in Siena in 1276 AD and mentioned by Dante Alighieri in his damning tone Purgatorio, Vernaccia is perhaps one of the oldest Italian white wines and the first one to be elevated to DOC in 1966 and DOCG in 1993. It's a racy white wine with notes of lemony citrus, crunchy green apples, underripe pears, fresh almonds, with this really interesting saline note on the finish and some bitter lime zest. It's super refreshing on a hot Tuscan day, so the Tuscans like to keep it in Italy for themselves. One of the most iconic wine-producing families in Siena is the Bindi Sirigardi family. Alessandra Cassini Bindi Sirigardi is the current familial manager for her family's vast wine estate. She's also the 23rd generation grape growing steward of her family vineyards. 23 generations. Her noble family's presence in Siena dates back to the Republic. And as such, they predate the aristocracy that came into place with Charlemagne. So rather than being titled as aristocrats, they're known as patricians, but consider themselves gentried farmers and stewards of the land. The family was originally from Montalcino, but they moved to Siena to join the Order of the People as local politicians. The Bindis and the Sigardis came together as powerful historical families often do, through marriage. Giovanni Bindi, a decorated military officer who was bestowed with a noble title in the 1400s, married the lovely Caledonia Sigardi. They didn't have children of their own, but they bequeathed their name Bindi Sigardi when they adopted their brother's son. The famous and powerful ancestors in this family include Niccolo di Giovanni, who in 1463 AD became the Magistrate of the Republic. Achille, in 1519 AD, was bestowed the powerful title, the Master of the Salt, and it was his son, Niccolo, who in 1530 AD became an orator to Pope Clement VII. The Bindi Sigardi family began growing grapes on their Sienese estate decades before the Frescobaldi and the Antinori families even broke ground. Their wine cellar dates back to 1067 AD, and their wine company was established in 1349 AD, making it one of the oldest in the world, still owned and operated by the same family. Storied not only in Italy, the Bindi Sigardi family generations have deep roots in the United States through their mother Joan, an American. Her ancestors settled the American colonies in 1635 AD, and her great-great-great-great-uncle even signed the Declaration of Independence. Alessandra's parents met at a bridge tournament in 1968, and their love story gave birth to the modern Bindi Sigardi Wine Company. Adhering to her creed, audacity, integrity, and authenticity, Alessandra planned to honor her family identity and heritage while modernizing production and emerging on the world stage through a fresh brand and new distribution channels, and we're so thankful that she did. Bindi Sigardi crafts wines from 3 family estates around Siena: Tenuta e Colli, Moccini, and Marcinella. The family cherishes their distinct heritage and their lands by extending the utmost care to the environment across their estates and the wildlands surrounding them. Attention is paid to natural grape growing practices, organic principles, with the wineries all employing sustainable technologies across the estate. Tenuta e Colli was established by the Bindi Sigardi family in the 1400s in the northern sector of Siena, and it's here amongst a limestone called Il Gaiolo di Siena, which is very rich in calcium carbonate, that the region is known for, that these Sangiovese vines thrive. The region is also known for a certain type of marble, a yellow, world-famous marble called Gaiolo Siena, that's in palaces and museums all across the European continent. So the soil in this vineyard is very unique. It's part of the Chianti and Chianti Classico DOCG. The Moccini estate lies north of Siena, but at the southern border of Chianti Classico, so it's not actually in the DOCG. This single vineyard is a parcel that was abutting a forest, creating a south-facing slope amphitheater that's very unique microclimate, and it's constructed of galestro schist, Albarese limestone, and marl soils. This fortress that sits on this land is now a wine cellar, was first constructed on the estate in 1067 AD, and it was once a military outpost for the region of Siena. The Marcinella estate has been under vine since the 6th century BC, when the Etruscans settled the lands of Cuisi just south of Siena. Each of these estates imparts a unique quality and characteristic to the wines that Bindi Sigardi produces. Alessandra owes these perceptible variations to the individual soils and the terroirs and microclimates within each estate. The soil makes all the difference with Sangiovese, she states. Bindi Sigardi focuses on Sangiovese as its signature grape of Tuscany and also the signature grape of the estate, but they do rear tiny amounts of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot at Moccini. In addition, the Bindi Sigardi families were amongst the founding members of the Chianti Classico Consortio in 1924 AD. Their dedication to Sangiovese is admirable in a region that is known for experimenting with international varietals. Climate change is another constant consideration for wine producers in 2021. Tuscan wine growers are not immune to the noticeable changes in the vineyards in the wine-producing world. Alessandra imparts, global warming, yes, the climate has changed, no doubt. My dad used to harvest around October 1st to October 5th, but now we are harvesting 2 weeks earlier around September 20th. Grape growers, in efforts to mitigate climate disasters, are moving vineyards slowly higher elevations, and Sangiovese clones are prone to earlier maturation already. The question remains, however, how much higher in elevation can the vineyards go, particularly in the region of Tuscany, without displacing the wildlands and the protected forests around them? Will Tuscan vintners continue to explore international varietals and hybrids to modify their wines to endure the warming world? And if so, what will be lost to history? Still, Alessandra said in a recent interview with Bartholomew Broadbent that there are deep roots in her winery, and she wants to give fruit to her legacy while honoring her family's Sienese heritage and their love of Sangiovese. Alessandra, with her vision and focus on preserving the beauty and tradition of her lands, is going back to the tradition and focusing on Sangiovese as an expression of Siena and of Tuscany. More than in most sectors, everyone in the world of wine is aware and concerned with the threats of climate on the grape growing and winemaking production. We've read the scientific reports, we follow the news, we share in wine media, We've witnessed the changes in the wines in the glass across the globe. I began to explore wine and climate change in 2007, and as a keen wine taster who's also very sensitive to alcohol levels, I watched the alcohol levels begin to creep up from 11 and 12% for most European wines to 14, 15, 5, and even 15% plus. That's bordering on the bottom range for fortified wines. I noticed riper, more tropical, candied, and brazenly bold fruit flavors and notes popping out of the glass from even cold climate wines, and often accompanied by the heat and the lack of balance and finesse. In October 2010, I was in a devastating automobile accident that resulted in a serious traumatic brain injury that halted my wine career. So I turned my attention to higher level academics and healed my body and my brain during that period of time. I continued collecting wine credentials and earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in wine studies. Lee Hanna's then controversial paper, Climate Change, Wine, and Conservation, with its now famous predictive wine region displacement maps, was released in 2013 when I was working on my master's degree, and it completely focused the trajectory of my academic studies. I immersed myself in wine and climate change with a World Heritage niche, even presenting conference papers at Stanford and in Portugal. When I went back to work full-time a few years later, the wines were topping out at 16% alcohol. These wines were saccharine and jammy fruit bombs that tasted like you were drinking a brandy cordial. I just couldn't drink them anymore. Rampant annual wildfires and destructive hail and frost destroying wine regions and vineyards became de rigueur in the news. Climate change conversation became a daily one, and people were finally listening to the scientists and viticultural scientists and taking heed. While I was speaking at Stanford, my pro-UNESCO wine region World Heritage status and protection paper met with thought-provoking criticism from a world-renowned cultural scholar. His acerbic feedback suggested that UNESCO was not an asset to the wine world regions and the pending climate change plight, but a bureaucratic detriment that would hinder the necessary adaptability. After contemplating that pretty harsh feedback for 2 years, I decided that I needed to dive further into the topic. So, in 2017, I headed to Portugal to earn my doctorate studying wine, climate volatility, and cultural legacy. While I was there, I attended the 2018 Climate Change Leadership Conference in Porto for the Porto Protocol. The event was designed to bring renowned viticulturists, economists, conservationists, academics, and other interested parties and stakeholders to the wine world together to tackle the heavy burden of climate change as it pertains to wine. My aim in going was to interview the former UNESCO Director General, Irina Bokova, about World Heritage wine regions and climate volatility. My interest lies at the intersection of culture and industry, focusing on the losses and gains, not just to industry, but to culture, ecosystem, identity, and heritage, alongside the practical and obvious alterations in the wine landscape itself. I was lucky enough to interview Ms. Bokova about the implications of UNESCO World Heritage designations and protections for wine regions, vineyards, and intangible cultural heritage like champagne production techniques. I presented my skepticism about the advantages of bestowing wine regions with this UNESCO status and protection. These regions are already under a stranglehold of bureaucracy and AOC, DOCG laws and layers that will take years to unravel. Adding UNESCO World Heritage to that status will just make it more difficult and more time-consuming, something that many wine regions no longer have to spare. She considered my approach quite thoughtfully and then suggested that I should be giving the talk about UNESCO and not her. She was firm in her decades-long devotion to conservation at all costs, an idea she has since softened on, as she learns more about wine production, industry legacy, and how climate is already etching away at those traditions and heritage. Reading from their website, UNESCO is convinced that no development can be sustainable without a strong culture component. Indeed, only a human-centered approach to development based on mutual respect and open dialogue among cultures can lead to lasting, inclusive, and equitable results. Yet, until recently, culture has been the missing component from the development equation. To ensure that culture takes its rightful place in development strategies and processes, UNESCO has adopted a three-pronged approach. It spearheads worldwide advocacy for culture and development while engaging an international community to set clear policies and legal frameworks, working on the ground support governments, local stakeholders to safeguard heritage, strengthen creative industries, and encourage cultural pluralism. So when UNESCO is setting up these ideal standards for wine regions around the world, one of the things that happens is it increases tourism and awareness for these regions, but it also brings in such an influx of bureaucracy that these regions can't change. That, in my opinion, when I first started researching this topic, I was pro-UNESCO, and after the engagement with the person at the Stanford conference, I had to turn around and say, well, this might work for museum collections or places like Machu Picchu or the Grand Canyon. It's not necessarily viable for an agricultural environment in which climate change is having such a negative impact. In March 2019, the second Climate Leadership Conference took place in Porto. Most of the most influential parties of wine came together again with new people, signing the Porto Protocol Agreement, which is something like the Paris Agreement, but it's specifically aimed at helping wine regions and winemakers develop and institutionalize best practices for sustainability with the hopes of mitigating climate change. Unfortunately, very few, if any, of these approaches specifically addresses the cultural aspects of wine and climate change. My soon-to-be defended doctoral dissertation is being transformed into a consumer-facing book called From Grapes to Wrath, Wine in the Age of Climate Change, which I plan to release in 2022. I've taught this course at the university level on 3 continents, and much of my research lies in the cultural sector and draws on scientific work presented by Lee Hanna and Greg Jones and other prominent figures that are working around the science of wine and climate change, but I focus more on the socioeconomic and cultural concepts such as identity, heritage, legacy, aesthetics, and the cultural, economic, environmental gains and losses. For example, it's well known that grapes are a monoculture in agriculture. The emerging wine regions that are outlying and non-traditional, such as British Columbia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the UK, Serbia, northern China, Nova Scotia, Colorado, northern Michigan, and parts of New York, are converting to wine production, but their natural ecosystems will be displaced and lost along with their non-wine drinking culture. While this might be an exciting and great opportunity for new industry in these regions, it could also be devastating to the landscape and the health of these existing cultures. Careful thought and planning must go into these emerging regions to prevent more damage and preserve existing traditions, ecosystems, and cultural elements while embracing the new. That's one of the things that the wine industry really needs to focus on, is setting these new regions up for success. On the other hand, traditional regions across continental Europe, Northern California, the Pacific Northwest, much of Australia, and even South Africa must be allowed to adapt by adopting new techniques and policies for their viticulture. If most wine regions are going to survive climate crisis, they must be allowed to adapt, and quickly, in order to mitigate the current climate trends by modifying their viticultural practices and their varietal plantings. In a perhaps too late attempt, Bordeaux has already permitted the addition of 6 new grapes. They passed the law a couple of years ago. It went into effect this year. These 6 grapes are warm climate or hybrid grapes that can tolerate heat and drought. And they're primarily going to be allowed in the non-classified Bordeaux, in Bordeaux Superior. I don't think we're going to find them in the higher levels of the appellation for a few years, but inevitably I bet they work their way even into Margaux and Saint-Julien. If these new plantings are found to be successful in the lower levels of the AOC, further adoption by the higher levels and the higher categories of wine are bound to be tested and probably adopted within the next decade. Storms are surging, stronger, massive flooding is happening, crippling winter weather are becoming common, grape freeze, bud loss, vine loss is all something that's happening every year in vineyards around the world. In addition, droughts are at an all-time high, and rampant forest and field fires are ripping across landscapes on nearly every continent. Everybody in the United States watched Napa and Sonoma struggling for weeks upon weeks on end, with massive wineries being lost in 2020. Every year brings the report that this is the hottest year on record. This is the hottest year on record all across the globe. It's the hottest year in 20 years. And this trend is not subsiding anytime soon. The issue is that in the recent decade, climate patterns are on fire, quite literally. The rates and velocity of change have never occurred in human history, and humans are having an exceptionally difficult time adapting to the change and mitigating the destruction that comes with it. The 2013 paper that I referenced earlier by academic climatologist Lee Hanna and his band of colleagues, the Climate Change, Wine, and Conservation paper, was swiftly met by rebukes such as why climate change will not dramatically decrease viticultural suitability in main wine-producing areas by 2050, by Cornelius van Leeuwen, were egotistically flawed in their nitpicking nature. Climate change, wine, and conservation changed my view on ecologically focused efforts that were underway in the wine industry. The paper illustrates threats to production, quality, region, and increasing demands on ecological resources such as water and increased pesticide use. It was around the same time that I was working in the wine industry as a distributor rep, and I met so many international, multi-generational winemakers, and they were seriously worried about their product and their professions as they were their heritage and legacy. Lee Hanna, the senior scientist at CI's Moore Center for Science, has become one of the foremost advocates for addressing climate change by rethinking vineyards and wine region locations. His paper and his graphs and charts, some which are pictured here today, illustrate the suitability for wine-producing regions is rapidly shifting from traditional latitudes between 30 and 50 degrees latitude toward the poles. Shortly after Hanna's report, Dr. Gregory Jones, famous for being a climate scientist and a winemaker in Oregon, published a paper called Climate, Terroir, in Wine, What Matters Most in Producing Great Wine, which continued Hanna's discussion but tempered much of his catastrophizing. Jones is the son of a winemaker and is slightly more optimistic about the future of the wine industry. He has since written much and spoken at length about the threats of climate change to the wine industry. Benjamin Cook's Global Warming Pushes Wine into Uncharted Territory and Linda Johnson Bell's Climate Change in Wine were soon to follow. Johnson Bell, in particular, established the Wine and Climate Change Institute in England in 2016 to further study the impacts of climate volatility on the wine industry. She pretty much founds her approach entirely on Hannah's research, which is apparent throughout her book. As it turns out, Hannah was more correct than scientists in his arena anticipated in 2013. Even the esteemed researcher, Dr. Gregory Jones, who originally softened his findings and disputed some of them, got on board. By 2021, in conferences for Wine Future 2021 and the Institute of Masters of Wine, Jones flatly states that climate change impacts are arriving much, much earlier than he previously estimated. Hannah's provocative maps, widely distributed through venues ranging from the Society of Wine Educators, the Wine and Spirits Education Trust, to Wine Folly, in nearly every mainstream wine magazine, have had an indelible mark on the wine industry at large. We're forced to pay attention to what he was saying all those years ago. We were timid to adopt his theories in 2013, but by 2021, it is plain to everyone in wine that his estimates were conservative. According to Jones, climate impacts are arriving surprisingly fast and everywhere in the world. To quote him, "Today, as in the past, climate is clearly one of the most important factors in success to all agricultural systems, whether it's influencing the crop, including wine grapes, to be suitable in any given region." He writes that climate is arguably the most critical environmental aspect in ripening fruit to its optimal quality to produce desired wine styles. Landscape and soil are only mediating factors in the relationship between the climate and the grapevine. A change in climate is a change in terroir. One major takeaway from Greg Jones' recent talks in February for the Masters of Wine on the 17th and for Wine Future 2021 on the 24th is that the crisis is real, it's here, and we are not doing enough to mitigate it, and even if that was possible. Here are a few climate volatility facts to ponder. More than 90% of independent scientists concur that global climate temperatures are increasing and may increase by 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit by 2025. That's just 4 years. Changing landscapes of the world wine regions and agricultural regions is something that's already underway. And wine grapes are an excellent barometer for agricultural crops when it comes to change. They're considered an indicator crop. So if any testing needs to be done around climate change in food crops, grapes are the place to start. One 2013 study went so far as to project that 2/3 of today's wine regions won't be viable grape-producing regions in their current state by 2030. 9 years. They'll simply be too hot. This will have a dramatic consequence for wine. Too warm of a growing season means grapes are too high in sugar with low acidity, and they make an unbalanced, unstructured wine that's high in alcohol. And the consumers are trending to a lower alcohol wine in 2020 and 2021. And if the weather gets too hot early in the season, the grapevines bud too soon and can be destroyed, and often are, by late hail and frost. This is something we see in Burgundy frequently, and it's going to start happening in other regions as well. The sugar to acid ratio and the timing of the harvest are critical aspects of winemaking, and these aspects are directly threatened by global warming. As Alessandra Casindi Bindi Sigardi suggested earlier, in their vineyards, they're harvesting 2 weeks early. In many other places in the world, like Germany, they're harvesting 4 weeks earlier than they ever have before. In addition, grapes are a very thirsty crop, and the water demands are increasing as climate change increases. Safe water is already a scarce resource around the globe, and drinking water even more so. So allocating this resource of water to the grapevine community and the grape growing industry is going to be increasingly taxing on that resource. In an email I received from Benjamin Cook, who is a climate scientist at Columbia University, stated that climate volatility is a larger problem than anybody ever thought. Over the next 20 to 50 years, vineyards around the world will undergo drastic changes. In 2016, he led a study that analyzed weather data in vineyard records going back to 1600 in France predominantly. And he noticed that in the 20th century alone, the temperature rose on average 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. But France is one of the luckier locations, Cook said. Places that are already dry and warm are likely to face some of the biggest challenges in the coming decades. Places like Napa Valley and Sonoma, the Sierra foothills, the majority of Australia, and most of the Mediterranean basin. Vitis vinifera grapes in particular, the ones that make our classic wines that we know all over the world, thrive in an average climate of 53 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Pinot Noir in particular, which is one of the most treasured but most fragile varieties, the one that makes Burgundy famous, does best when it's exposed to short temperature window of 57 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And already Burgundy is warmer than that. For the grape varietal like Pinot Noir, climate change essentially spells a disaster. With such a small temperature window for it to thrive, even minor changes could make these famous Pinots too hot. We're already seeing this in Burgundy, although the last couple vintages are considered stellar vintages because they're expressing much more fruit than before and have a little bit different acidity to alcohol balance. How long can we sustain that upward trend? Not very long for that particular grape. So let's talk about some terroir specific information. The 2019 headline that heat waves shrink champagne harvest by almost 20% was put forward by Bollinger's cellar master, Gilles Descot, in a conversation that he had with the Drinks Business website. He said, "We were expecting to have 11,500 kilograms per hectoliter naturally, but with the spring frosts, then hail, then storms, and powdery mildew, which all affected our Chardonnay, then we got this heat wave, and we can barely expect to reach 9,500 kilograms per hectoliter now," representing a decline of almost 20%. He said that the worst factor for the quantity was the heat, commenting that temperatures reached over 43 degrees Celsius at the beginning of August in Champagne, which caused the berries to shrivel. That is a tremendous heat fluctuation for this cold climate region. Descot also said that the harvest would be very quick due to the high level of maturity and low yields in the fields. Champagne vignerons began experimenting with more still wines in order to mitigate future losses. And that day actually arrived just at the end of 2020 when several champagne houses announced the pending release of their still wine ranges. Coupled with the 18% loss during 2020 due to tariffs and the pandemic, Champagne is realizing that their way of wine and their way of life is under threat. Around that same time in 2019, Germany released reports that the harvest in the Mosel Valley was going to be 4 weeks earlier than ever recorded. And this was at a time when Germany preliminarily set an all-time high temperature record in August of 2019 with a high of 104.9 degrees Fahrenheit, previously on record, was topped with a national high of 108.6 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than it's ever been in Germany. And how is that affecting German wine? Well, stylistically, German wines have always been known for their bright, racy acidity and their low alcohol levels between 10 and 11%. Alcohol levels are rising in Germany too because now the berries are getting so ripe so quickly that the sugar levels are going up and the phenolic ripeness of those berries isn't quite there yet. So their wines are no longer lingering around 11%, but they're often arriving at 13 or 13.5%. This is a massive stylistic change for these wines, as they're losing some of their acidity and they're definitely losing their aroma profiles. So, what does this all mean for wine and wine culture? What will happen to Alessandra Cassini Bindi Sigardi and the centuries-old Bindi Sigardi wine producing estate when climate change makes mitigation and adaptation an impossible game of diminishing returns? How will she then honor her 23 generations of wine legacy? Will she be able to remain loyal to her favorite grape, Sangiovese? And by the way, Sangiovese is currently being tested in Germany as a warm climate grape. How will wine producers like her adapt to this changing world? How will they reinvent themselves if their entire personal and familial identities are lost, along with their professional occupations? Alessandra's daughter is the 24th generation of Bindi Sigardis immersed in the Sienese wine life. What will Alessandra do next? The answer isn't a simple one, because her lands are protected not just by the DOCG laws, but also by the UNESCO World Heritage layers. Alessandra is obligated to maintain the status quo of Sienese wine production. She does not have the liberty to plant heat-resistant varietals and hybrid grapes. Without the ability to adapt, Alessandra is in jeopardy of losing not just her thriving wine business, but 23 generations of her familial history and cultural identity. How can we help Alessandra? Will our languishing attempts at employing green-friendly, organic, biodynamic, and sustainable policies and lowering the global wine industry carbon footprint output help her? Seriously doubtful. Without a total reset, we'll all lose this war. The new reality for the wine industry is here now, and the new reality is mitigation, modification, and migration. Mitigation is something that's underway in nearly every vineyard around the world. There are a number of vineyard adjustments that can be made to mitigate the effects of climate change. Vineyard owners can modify row orientation for better heat management, for example. They can improve trellising and irrigation. They can plant at higher elevations and employ green crop cover. There's so many different things they can do. Irrigation will allow farms and vineyards to maintain yields during droughts and mitigate some of their losses, but as I talked earlier, water is becoming an increasingly difficult resource to access. So how much irrigation can be allocated toward this crop? Planting on north-facing slopes in North Hemisphere and south-facing slopes in the Southern Hemisphere can definitely help reduce heat stress, as the vines would be a little bit more shaded. Ultimately, land management will likely be increasingly important as the climate shifts, said Benjamin Cook in that email. But land management can only do so much. Cook's study found that every time the temperature increases by 1 degree centigrade, which is about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, grape harvests must be moved up by a full week. Vineyards can't maintain earlier and earlier harvests forever. The grapes aren't getting ripe enough. They're not having phenolic development in the grapes, so that they're not getting the beautiful aromatics that they're known for. And if they're ripened too early, they're also going to be very high in sugar, low in acidity, so that a balanced wine won't be possible. In addition, when the cycle of the vine is disturbed too much, it's susceptible to different threats, different types of pests, frost and rain late in the season before harvest. All of these different things are going to impact the nature of the grape that's being produced. Modification is already largely underway in regions like Bordeaux, Napa, and Champagne, amongst many others. Introducing new varietals and hybrid grapes is an important step to survival. Traditional recipes will be lost, such as the traditional Bordelaise standards, but what else can be done? They've allowed 6 new warm grapes in. Some are from Portugal. These grapes are going to change the traditional recipe of what it means to be Bordeaux. So what's being lost there because of climate change is this tradition that basically sets the standard for what is quality and luxury wine around the world. The final step in the pattern of mitigation, modification, and migration is migration. One of the greatest concerns of climate volatility across the world are climate refugees, whether that's people fleeing storm patterns and destructive things that are happening along the sea line as the oceans rise and wipe out cities. That's projected, particularly Al Gore in his Climate Reality speaks to that quite a lot. But along with the people, plants are going to migrate and animals are going to migrate, taxing the new lands and creating an overpopulation and upsetting these ecosystems. Vineyards are also going to upset these new ecosystems. Vineyards are a monoculture, and when you bring them in and put them into a new environment, you're displacing all of the natural flora and fauna from that environment. So what's going to be gained and what's going to be lost? Vineyards are already migrating to new climates, closer to the North and South Pole, higher in elevation, but at what cost to these frontiers, and how far can they go? We're planting vineyards in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark, Nova Scotia, even Siberia, northern parts of China. But how far is the threshold? How much farther can they go north or south and still produce balanced, beautiful, great wines? So what can we do about it? High wine culture is designed to perpetuate a style and a myth of a region. Wine consumers are a bit manipulated into buying into that set of circumstances and expectations based on historical and cultural standards. These circumstances and expectations are unsustainable in the current climate crisis. There's simply no way to sustain Bordeaux as the Bordeaux of 1855 when the quality strata was initiated. Or Burgundy. The Burgundy that created Domaine Romani Conti may not exist in 5 to 10 years. The solutions must be found in a holistic approach to addressing the climate volatility issue, social, economic, political, and agricultural spheres, along with tourism. Educating the consumer every step of the way is fundamental. The power of wine to promote the cultural identity of a region is enormous. Before the pandemic, eno and gastrotourism were the fastest growing sectors of tourism, and they fall under the agro-adventure tourism umbrella. Obviously, the pandemic put a huge damper on that sector, but it's still going to be the leading edge of tourism when tourism opens back up. Whether it's joining a structured tour package led by a knowledgeable local guide or individual travel into the wine region destinations, the new and often affluent tourist wants to immerse themselves in the environment and all of its delectable abundance. They want the experience. They want the romance of going to wine country. Shifting consumer focus to the emerging regions and to adopting environmentally friendly practices like selecting bag-and-box packaging, refillable containers, and even cans, along with choosing to source food and beverages from locally produced entities, along with reframing that mid-tiered wine luxury assumption, can be a path forward. Local wine can fulfill the commercially produced mainstream category without importing value wines from countries like Australia, Chile, and Argentina. Orient local wines to assume the position of value everyday drinkers, encouraging locavore wines just as we do locavore foods. Wine consumers are strongly resistant, bordering on opposed to new wine regions, even when most consumers and many critics, wine writers, and wine professionals are often unable to distinguish between them. from the classically fetid regions in blind taste testings. We all learned that in 1976, didn't we? Additionally, consumers are climate curious, but they're not demanding sustainable or preventative actions, at least not in the United States, in part because the topic is heavily politicized, but also because they have this romanticized image of wine country and preconceived notions that we are already green friendly. So essentially, more focus on green vineyards along with sustainability in wineries must be adopted. In California, 85% of wines are already made in sustainable wineries. In Spain, the Torres family has been an outspoken early adopter of sustainable wine production. His multi-generational Spanish wines are iconic across the globe, and he debuted his wine property in Chile in 1979 because he was seeking out more sustainable terroirs. However, he reports that his efforts towards sustainability have no measurable impact on his sales. Biodiversity in the vineyard is a must, and adopting heat-resistant varietals and hybrids will be critical to survival in existing and emerging wine regions in the world. The consumer is very slow to adopt alternative packaging, such as bags and boxes and cans that can be made from more easily recyclable materials. Glass may be recyclable, but the costs are quite high, and the added transportation costs of glass bottles are one of the least eco-friendly options available to wine producers. Consumers are looking for green certification emblems on wine labels, ranging from sustainable all the way to biodynamic and salmon safe. So at least the consumer is, particularly the younger consumer, is interested in the topic. We, the trade, just have to do a much better job of educating them. The wine industry is a $340 billion plus global industry, employing an estimated 1 million plus people on 6 continents. Wine has been consistently critical part of the socioeconomic, political, geographical, and cultural growth of civilizations from the late Neolithic period through the modern era. Many of the world's oldest wine regions in France, Italy, Portugal, Switzerland, Germany, and other countries have won the UNESCO World Heritage status in attempts to save the industry under serious threat from unmitigated climate volatility. Yet, is that the best way to preserve 6,000 years of tradition? It isn't really working. Germany is known for its racy Rieslings, France for its vibrant, sparkling wines, elegant reds, and crisp whites. Spain is famous for brooding reds, effervescent rosés, and whites. Italy for its rustic wines from Tuscany, Piedmont, the Veneto, Lazio, and beyond. And of course, Portugal for its luscious dessert wines. But these styles are already changing. These regions are losing their essential identities. This climate volatility is responsible for the rapid rise of emerging regions like the ones I mentioned in Colorado, Canada, China, the UK, Norway, Switzerland, Denmark, and even Siberia. It's up to you, the wine trade, educating every link in the chain from the grape farmers to the winemakers and the consumer about climate volatility and its effect on wine will be critical to the very survival of wine as we know it. Will this multi-billion-dollar industry continue to grow and thrive in the coming century, or will climate change render it extinct? Thank you. Please reach out to me via Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and on my website, chasinggrapes.com, to carry on this interesting conversation.